put him up underneath Sando. They're going to show the eye back behind the fullback here at fourth down. Could be up to the offensive line. No, Critzel's going to throw for it. Got to get it off. They go for the ball game. Touchdown! Touchdown! Michael Jenkins on 4th and 1. Would you believe it? Craig Krenzel strikes with a minute and a half left. Holy Buckeye!
Trust me, I already know what you're thinking. How could a football play bring anyone closer to God? You know, I contemplated making this video because the thought seems insane, but this story is about more than just the impact of a single football play on my life. In fact, this was simply the play that defined the 2002 Ohio State football season, which happened on November 9, 2002. I was 18 at the time and a freshman at The Ohio State University, and it was one of many series of events during this time in my life that I know God was speaking to me in unique ways. And just so you are aware, this is the first time I have ever presented the story in its entirety. In fact, I don't even think my wife or anyone in my family knows everything I'm about to reveal in this video. And anyone that knows me will tell you that I am not known to be a religious person at all. But it is pretty crazy what happened to me during this time in my life, so be sure to stick around for the whole video if this kind of stuff intrigues you. Now before I get started, there are a couple things I want to mention. The first is I have decided to try something unique in this video, and you will notice verses popping up in the background at key points throughout. Some of you may recognize where they are from, but for those that don't, do not worry. This is a part of the story, and I will explain where they came from and why they are included near the end of the video. The second is you might be wondering what ultimately convinced me to make this video. But for me to get to that, let me first provide some background on myself. I am currently 38 years old and happily married with 2 kids. My wife and I have lived in Charlotte, North Carolina for over 10 years now and have been married for 13 years. Now, despite God having such a profound impact on my life at the young age of 18, my wife and I have yet to commit to going to church on Sundays since the day we got married. And there really is no other excuse for this other than what I would describe as selfishness and laziness. I believe this is one of the primary reasons I have felt more disconnected from God as time has progressed from my college years, and why my wife and I have struggled to connect with people. My wife and I both grew up in a small town in Kentucky, and yes, we are high school sweethearts. Also, the interesting thing is we first met each other in church when we were both young kids, but we didn't form a relationship until both of us reached our high school years. Speaking of my life as a kid, I grew up with 2 great parents that are still alive to this day and have always been, and continue to be, as supportive as they should have been, and I really am blessed to have had them in my life. Both grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and also went to Ohio State, which is obviously one of the primary reasons for me choosing to attend this university. Like myself, they are both adamant Buckeye fans, and we share countless memories from all the football games we have experienced together over the years. For a little bit more background on my immediate family, I am the youngest of 3, which includes a brother and a sister that I am also fortunate to have had in my life. My parents were the type that forced us to go to church every Sunday, and not only did I go to church, but I was in the youth group, I was in Bible school, I went to summer camp, you name it. So, as you can tell, I was much more active in the church as a kid than I am today. But even though this was the case, I still didn't really understand what it meant to have a relationship with God at the time. I always put on a front that I didn't enjoy going to church, but I secretly did. The truth is, it was the only place that I found where I could easily make friends, and it was one of the few instances growing up where I quote-unquote felt like I fit in. I often didn't feel this way outside of church, particularly in school, which I believe is one of the factors that ultimately led to a very dark time in my life, which I'll get to later in this video. Now with that out of the way, I can get back to telling you what ultimately convinced me to make this video. So about a month before I started making this, I was browsing through the career networking site LinkedIn. Like most social media sites, there's a section you can go to that suggests people you may know to connect with. As I was browsing through this list of people, someone in particular caught my attention. When I was attending college, I briefly interned a couple summers at an automotive plant, and this person that I noticed on LinkedIn was my supervisor at this plant. He was tough and expected a lot from you, but he also had a confidence about himself that stuck out. He was a devout Christian that wrote and played music at his local church and was an adamant follower of the Lord. So not really thinking much of it, I decided to add him as a connection. The very next day, I got a LinkedIn notification on my phone, and it was a direct message from this person which said, "Hello, Jonathan. Long time since your stint at Tower Automotive in Bardstown, Kentucky. Judging by your profile, career path, the Lord has blessed you. Hope all is well with you and your family." I thanked him in my response and followed it up by asking him if he was still making music, and his response was, "Not as much music as I would like. I do play guitar and lead worship at our local church every Sunday. I have a YouTube channel which has a couple of music videos. I also added a couple of messages I felt the Lord wanted me to share. Check out the music videos if you get an opportunity. After this brief interaction, I came to the realization that he was right. I really have been blessed by the Lord, despite my growing disconnection from Him. I have a great family, I have a great career as an engineer, and I have been extremely fortunate to have lived the life I have lived. However, coming to this realization brought a feeling of guilt because I knew I hadn't been holding up my end of the bargain with God. So one night, after my wife had fallen asleep, I decided to check out his YouTube channel and watch some of his videos. To my surprise, I felt a direct connection in his message. One thing he mentioned is that most of us think we are good people, but that it takes more than this to get into the kingdom of heaven. After saying this, he then mentioned something that really resonated with me.
It's up to us that are saved, that have experienced this born again, being born of the Spirit, up to us to share it with others. You know, Jesus gave the Great Commission. He said, go into all the world and tell the good news. Those that believe will be saved, and those who do not will be condemned. So there's instruction for us to go into all the world. He didn't say just your friends or family members or just those that you love, but he said go into all the world and tell the good news.
When I heard this, I came to the immediate realization that I have never told anyone, even my wife or family members, the story of how I was born again. I instantly felt ashamed and knew I was a coward because I have always been too prideful and embarrassed to admit my experiences and faith in God. So the very next day, my wife and I were having a conversation about our kids. Now, before telling you what she said to me, let me preface this by saying that my wife and I rarely mention anything about going to church, and in the rare times that we ever went, it was typically me pressing her to go. But to my surprise, she randomly mentioned that we really should start going to church because our kids needed exposure to that environment. I thought it was especially odd that she said this to me the day after I watched that YouTube video. It was at that moment that I started to think, could God be speaking to me again? That night, I prayed to God to reflect on these two instances and admit my failures as a Christian. I told Him that I realized how much He had blessed me, and yet I had never fully shared my story with anyone. I admitted that my failure to get involved in church and the community is likely the reason my wife and I were struggling to establish a strong support system around us. And despite knowing that I was blessed, I still felt an emptiness inside. I then concluded the prayer by asking for His help and to come back to me how He had early in my college years. Now you might be thinking that God showed me a sign that Sunday when we went to church, but you would be wrong because my wife and I ended up not going. I realize this is not a valid excuse, but I had to travel for work the next day, and many chores had stacked up on me that I needed to accomplish, one of which was to go to Costco for groceries. So feeling guilty for not going to church, I decided to look up Christian podcasts on my phone that I could listen to on my way to and from Costco, and the one I ended up finding was a show called Compelled. The podcast consists entirely of people telling their miraculous stories on how God and Jesus came into their lives and how they had become born again. So I randomly picked one episode to listen to, and wouldn't you know it, the very first show I selected provided the sign I had asked God for when I prayed to Him earlier that week. The story was about a man named Garrett Kell. I won't go into the details, but as I listened to his story, it was crazy how many parallels there were between my experience with God and his experience during his transformation. It was at that point that I knew God was speaking to me again. He was demanding that I share my story with the world. And so here we are now. Let's begin. I guess the best place to start would be towards the end of my middle school years. Up to this point, I had been a straight-A student and tried to do everything asked of me in school. I could be a bit of a troublemaker outside of school, but I did have a lot of friends and even had parties at my house that were a lot of fun. I was happy and living a very good life. But that would all change quickly starting with my 8th grade year due to a series of events, the first of which was finding out that my mother had cancer. Now fortunately, by the grace of God, she survived and is still alive to this day, but you can appreciate the effect this would have on a kid my age. I experienced an immediate rush of anxiety and many questions began running through my head. How much time did I have left with my mom? Would she even survive by the time I graduated high school? Around that exact same time, my parents had discovered that my sister, who is 10 years older than me, had unfortunately turned to drugs and became a severe heroin addict. This indirectly influenced me from the effect it had on my parents. They were shocked because neither of them had ever touched drugs growing up. And to make matters worse, because we lived in a small town, word got around quickly and everyone in their circle of friends had found out. Now, God bless my sister, but she has since miraculously pulled herself out of this terrible addiction years ago, and went on to get her master's degree and ultimately became a social worker to help people like her with drug addiction. The final event I should mention during this period in my life is my father decided to take a new job that was a couple hours driving distance from where we currently lived in Kentucky. When he initially made this decision, we were fully intending to move with him to his new job, but my parents ultimately decided that my mother and I would stay where we currently lived, and my father would rent a house in the city where his new job was located. Now, this doesn't seem like much of an issue, but combined with everything else I previously mentioned, this separation had a detrimental impact on all of us. And to make matters worse, my dad absolutely hated his new job, which only compounded the anxiety we were all experiencing at the time. However, his time at this new job wouldn't last long, as he decided to quit and move back in with my mom and I before I finished high school. So by the time I reached my sophomore year of high school, I myself had sunk into a deep depression, which was primarily attributed to all the anxiety that had piled up on me from all these events. I absolutely dreaded going to school every day, and I didn't feel like talking to anyone. Having this attitude did me no favors at school. I lost the ability to converse effectively with others, and often came off as awkward when I did. I also lacked the confidence to stick up for myself or the humility to admit when I messed up or was in the wrong. Having this type of personality made me an easy target, which caused even more internal anger and resentment, which was inadvertently reflected to others externally. I felt like I had nowhere to turn to, and it was like living through a never-ending battle between myself and the surrounding world, which ultimately led me into the downward spiral of depression. However, after about a year of living through this depression, I thought I had found a way out during my junior year of high school. Prior to this time in my life, I had never touched drugs and always resented people that used them, especially considering what I saw them doing to my sister in real time. But one Sunday, I was ironically picking up one of my friends from their house to take him to youth group since his parents were out of town. When I arrived, he was outside the back of his house smoking weed with a couple others from my high school. They asked me to join in, and for whatever reason that day, I didn't hesitate at all and decided to give in to the request. You know, it's funny how the devil entices you into his world, because right after that, my depression began to wane. Call it self-medicating, but I immediately started smoking weed and drinking alcohol more frequently, which allowed me to open myself to others in ways I had never been able to before. I wanted to hang out with others again. I frequently had people over to my house, I was going to parties, chasing girls, and gaining the respect of my peers. But anyone that eventually develops a dependency to drugs will tell you that it is always fun at first, but ultimately leads to a path that no one wants to go down. By the time I was a senior, my dependency to drugs had become a problem. I was constantly seeking the next way to get high. It was not uncommon for me to get drunk and high before school. My parents were in denial, but they knew something was going on. Of course, whenever they tried to say something to me, I resented them and acted like they only existed when I wanted money. They knew better than to give it to me, and so buying drugs started taking precedence over food. One time, I recall raiding their medicine cabinet, and I ended up stealing a large bottle of narcotics that were prescribed to my grandfather, who had recently spent his last days at my parents' house before passing away from cancer. My parents eventually recognized it was missing and asked me about it, and so I decided to blame it on my sister. My drug dependency had spiraled out of control, and when all was said and done, I was into pretty much every kind of drug aside from shooting heroin in my arm. This dependency eventually created resentments between myself and the people I associated with at the time. Deceit, hatred, jealousy, greed, paranoia, and anger were all compounding together in my head. One time, I recall getting very sick from taking too many drugs, and it literally felt like my body was shutting down. Word had gotten around town that I had turned into a rampant drug user, and I started to think everyone was out to get me. I was frequently ridiculed because of this attitude, and lost any respect I had from friends, even the ones I did drugs with, and my family. I was the definition of a lost soul. But in the midst of all the madness stood a glimmer of light, which would eventually pull me out of this darkness forever. As I mentioned earlier, chasing girls was a frequent objective during my drug escapade, and I'll tell you right now, I was terrible at it. A couple of my friends were very good smooth talkers and could get what they wanted from girls, but this ability ceased to exist within me. It never took long for the girls I tried to get with to see me for who I really was, a shallow, drug fiend jerk. However, there was one that, for whatever reason, saw something different in me and always stuck around during this dark time of my life. Her name was Ashley, and she was one of the sweetest and most caring girls I had ever met. Of course, I didn't respect her at the time and simply viewed her as a displacement avenue for my anger. I was my own worst enemy, and under the control of demons the devil had pushed inside of me. I was pretending to be something I wasn't, and hated this other person I had become. By the time I graduated from high school, thoughts of failure and shame were constantly running through my mind. I had always told myself I wasn't going to end up a drug addict like my sister, but here I was, already heading down the same path. I knew this wasn't sustainable, and I didn't want this life anymore, but I had no idea how to escape since I had become so dependent on it. So, feeling helpless and with nowhere else to turn, I decided to pray to God one night in bed. I had prayed before, but never like this. I began crying and admitted my failures, told him I was lost, and begged him multiple times to show me a way out. Given all the terrible things I had done, I had little hope this would do much. But lo and behold, God had a plan for me. It was amazing, but the very next day, it was as if a switch had flipped in my head. I felt like a completely different person, and my desire for drugs had completely waned, almost like developing a taste aversion to a type of food. I went from feeling the need to use drugs multiple times a day to having absolutely no interest in them at all. I also made the immediate decision to disassociate myself from the people I was using drugs with daily, which obviously didn't go over very well when I suddenly stopped answering their calls, since they often depended on me to take them to the locations to obtain the drugs. I knew they were all probably ridiculing me at the time for bailing on them, but I didn't care anymore. I knew I was done with that life, but at this point I had no idea who to turn to for support. You might say my parents, but I wasn't ready to admit to them at the time how deep my addiction had become. However, it didn't take long for me to figure it out. You see, God had been waving his gift right in front of my face the entire time, and after realizing what it was, I reached out to open it up. I immediately called Ashley, the girl I'd been treating so terribly, and asked her to come over. Little did she know before coming over on this day that our relationship would take on a new meaning from that day forward, and never look back. Now this is where the story starts to get interesting. At this point in my life, I started to begin sensing that God might be reaching his hand out to me, but little did I know that he was only getting started. During my stint on drugs, another obsession my friends and I had was listening to rap music, which was extremely popular during the late 90s and early 2000s. The reason we liked it so much was because the lifestyle they glorified matched ours, which included partying, drinking, doing drugs, getting women, you name it. But when I decided to make this change in my life, I no longer had any interest in listening to this music. Now, my older brother at the time was heavy into rock music, but he grew up during the 90s alternative era, which included bands such as Nirvana, Nine Inch Nails, Alice in Chains, Deftones, Soundgarden, and he introduced me to this music as a kid, but I was too young at the time to appreciate it. However, my eyes would soon be open to this genre of music shortly after reaching out to God. To continue keeping my mind off drugs following high school graduation, I decided to work a summer job, and my dad had set me up with one at a bottle labeling company that he partially owned at the time. About a week or two after I had prayed to God that night, I was turning bottles on the labeling line at work, and a particular song started playing on a radio next to me that immediately grabbed my attention. I had heard this song many times before, but never paid attention to the lyrics up to this point. Now, many of you may be tempted to turn this video off as soon as I tell you what song this was. But please, just bear with me. So the song was In the End by Linkin Park. I know, many of your eyes probably just rolled completely to the back of your head, but please, just hear me out. Linkin Park is one of the most misunderstood bands that I've ever known. Their early music resonated with millions at the time, but it also created a slew of haters that discounted them as whiny, always crying about how nobody loved them, and feeling sorry for themselves. But in my opinion, this is not at all what the lyrics from their first album, Hybrid Theory, reflected. Rather, they represented a person experiencing a deep internal struggle from recent mistakes, admitting and taking responsibility for these mistakes, and finding redemption by seeking an avenue to escape the dark situation these mistakes had presented. Does this sound familiar? And I never really understood the hate most had towards Linkin Park, because many of them liked the alternative bands that I mentioned from the 90s, whose lyrics pretty much reflected the same type of struggles experienced in life. Linkin Park was just less abstract about it and more direct and honest, which is ultimately what made them unique. Also, many people saw the members of Linkin Park as nothing but fake money grabbers that simply took advantage of the emotions of their fans. In fact, many people I knew called them the Backstreet Boys of rock music. Well, I think this assumption is quickly disproven when you read up on the abusive situations the lead singer Chester Bennington experienced as a child, and the fact that he tragically ended up committing suicide in 2017. He unfortunately could not escape the struggle and pain that was cursing him, but I sincerely believe this is what he was trying to do through his passionate singing of the lyrics in their first and second albums. Now that I'm off my soapbox, it's time to get back to the story. Before this time in my life, I had never connected on a personal level to music lyrics, but as I started paying attention to the ones in this Linkin Park song while working that day, I couldn't believe that I never recognized them before and how closely they replicated my current situation. As soon as I got home, I listened to their entire first album and was completely blown away. It was literally as if they had been following me over the past year of my life and knew exactly what I was going through. The drug addiction, the abusive friendships, the ridicule, the paranoia, the shame, and the redemption in recently deciding to let it all go. If you think I'm exaggerating, do me a favor, pause this video right now and read the song lyrics in their first and second albums. I truly believe this was God's way of helping me cope through the addiction, pain, confusion, and insecurity that I was seeking to escape from at the time, and it provided further confirmation that the decision to reach out to Him was the way to free myself from the madness. Now I know you might be thinking, big deal, He related to lyrics that millions of others were also able to relate to at the time. However, to me, the timing for which I recognized them was more significant than the relation. I recall chatting with one of my friends online at the time and asking him if he had heard of Linkin Park, and his response was basically, yeah, so what? You're just now listening to them? This album had been out for 2 years by the time I noticed it, and I had heard the song In the End before many times. I mean, how could you not? They played it every hour on the radio at the time. But as soon as I asked God for help, it was as if He immediately opened my mind and put me in the exact situation needed to recognize the lyrics of that song. Now, at this point, I could understand you being a bit underwhelmed by this story if it was all I had to tell. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. So by the end of the summer, I had established an extremely close relationship with Ashley, found an avenue to cope with my internal struggle through music, I was rebuilding the relationship with my parents as they started to recognize I was changing for the better, and I even rekindled some old friendships that I had prior to my drug issues. I was finally getting back on my feet again, but there was just one problem. I was enrolled in the engineering program at Ohio State and would soon have to leave it all in September. And as the time for me to leave got closer, anxiety was building up in me again, and all these questions started flooding my head. Was I doing the right thing to leave such a good situation and go to a place where I would be all on my own again? Why leave for Ohio and not just attend college in Kentucky? How was I going to do well in college classes at Ohio State when I struggled to understand the math and science classes in high school? Would Ashley, who was still in high school, commit to maintaining a long-distance relationship with me? Would I be able to commit to maintaining this relationship with her? In addition to all these questions, a few people around me at the time were not doing me any favors to alleviate these concerns. Some were telling me I was making a mistake by staying in this relationship with Ashley, and their excuse was the common cliche that long-distance relationships never work out. Another one I frequently heard indirectly from some friends was that I would flunk out of college and end up being a drug addict just like my sister. The anxiety and uncertainty of all this was making my head spin, but before I continue, I think this is the point where I need to introduce the 2002-2003 Ohio State football team. Prior to the 2002 football season, it had been over 30 years since Ohio State had won a national championship. They did have several great football teams in the 90s when John Cooper was the coach, which were always on the brink of winning a championship, but they would ultimately choke against their hated arch-rival Michigan every single time. Any Buckeye fan that lived through this era would tell you that it was an extremely painful era to witness. Cooper only went 2-10 against Michigan, and it was ultimately the reason for him getting fired in 2000. Enter Jim Tressel, who was next in line to be his predecessor starting with the 2001 football season. Jim Tressel came from Youngstown State, which was a Division II school, so no one knew what to expect from him when he arrived. However, leading up to his first year coaching, he made a bold promise and guaranteed a win against Michigan.
That you'll be proud of our young people in the classroom, in the community, and most especially in 310 days in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on the football field.
His first year as a coach didn't go that well, as Ohio State ended up only going 7-5 with a bowl loss, but he lived up to his promise and beat Michigan that year, which was all it took to give Buckeye fans hope. And little did the fans know what Tressel would have in store for them the very next season. Defining the 2002-2003 Ohio State football season as anything but insane would be doing it injustice. The team was mostly carried by their intimidating and opportunistic defense, but their offense, well, let's just say it had a pulse, and that pulse was primarily true freshman running back Maurice Clarett. And given the fact that Tressel many times called punting the most important play in football, You could say the 2002 team was the polar opposite of Ohio State teams of present day. Going into my freshman year of college, I really didn't have many expectations for the football team, but one thing was for sure, I was very excited about being able to get season tickets as a student. Growing up, I had gone to a game here and there, but it was surreal to me that I would now be able to attend every single home game. There were 3 home games prior to classes starting, and I made the 4-hour drive there and back on the same day to attend each of them, one of which is of major significance to the story. A little over a week before I had to move into my dorm on campus, I prayed to God again. This time, I told God that I really wanted to maintain the relationship with Ashley, but was confused on whether or not doing this and moving to Columbus were the right decisions. The love Ashley and I shared with each other was growing every day, but even she had serious doubts that I was going to make the effort to maintain the relationship once I moved away and started college. I asked God that day if it would be possible for Him to show me a sign that the path I was on was the correct one. And wouldn't you know it, the answer to my prayer would be provided that very next Saturday. Ohio State had won their first 2 football games of the season with ease, but the game on this upcoming Saturday was a top 10 matchup on the national stage against Washington State, and figured to be a barn burner. The game started out this way in the first half, with Washington State leading 7-6 at the end of the second quarter. But then Maurice Clarett absolutely went off and decided that he wanted to turn himself into a household name during the second half of that game. The guy was only a true freshman, and he was breaking tackles left and right, running people over, and continuously making long run after long run. It was truly a spectacular performance to witness in person, more so by a true freshman, and the best one of his short career at Ohio State. He finished the game with 230 yards rushing, and Ohio State ended up winning the game comfortably that day 25-7. And it was at that point that I began to think that this Ohio State team could be destined for something special. Now you might be asking at this point where the answer to my prayer was in all this. Well, I had a lot of time to contemplate what I had just witnessed that day on my 4-hour drive back to Kentucky, and then it suddenly dawned on me. Maurice Clarett's jersey number was 13, and wouldn't you know, Ashley, who was one of the best on her team, just so happened to be playing soccer in high school at the time, and guess what her jersey number was? That's right, 13. Immediately after realizing this, I knew God was telling me that the path I was on was the correct one. I was to attend Ohio State and do whatever it took to maintain this relationship with Ashley. I know some of you are thinking this number 13 nonsense was just a freak one-time coincidence and that I was just seeking something that wasn't really there. But to put your mind at ease, let's fast forward just a bit in my life. Spoiler alert, Ohio State ended up going on to win the national championship that year in unbelievable fashion. Shortly after the championship game, I very clearly recall a conversation I had with my mother. I wish I could find it now, but she brought to my attention either a magazine or a newspaper article that highlighted the number 13 seeming to be Ohio State's lucky number that year, and pointed out the unnatural number of times it had presented itself during the season. For example, Ohio State had 13 seniors on the roster that year. They started out the season ranked number 13 in the AP poll. The jersey number for their catalyst on the offensive side of the ball was 13. It was the first time in program history that they had gone 13-0 in a regular season, and their 14th national championship game against Miami just so happened to occur on January 3rd. Now let me ask you this. Are you really going to sit there and tell me that you still think this was a coincidence? Put yourself in my shoes. If you were a teenager at the time and had experienced all of this immediately after asking God for help, would you not have been convinced yourself? Finally, would you believe it if I said these weren't the only times the number 13 has presented itself to me in other relatable ways? Yeah, I'll get to that shortly. First, I want to rewind back and provide a little more perspective on just how incredible the Ohio State season was that year and the message I found in it through God. Half of Ohio State's 14 games that season were decided by a touchdown or less, and many ended up being much closer than they should have been, primarily attributed to their sputtering offense and considering Clarett experienced minor injuries throughout the season and didn't play in several games. Buckeye fans were literally on edge almost every single conference game, and there seemed to be a key play in almost every one of them made at the exact time necessary for them to win. Not only this, but there were so many close calls, which had they gone the other way, Ohio State would have likely lost those games. I wasn't exaggerating at the beginning of this video when I told you that play against Purdue defined the football season. And conveniently for this story, the play just so happens to be referred to as Holy Buckeye to this day. There is even a Wikipedia page on this play if you look it up in a search engine, and after witnessing it and the commentary that followed by Brent Musburger, I knew at that point in my heart that this team was destined to go all the way. However, pretty much every pundit in sports media at the time had the opposite opinion. And despite being one of 2 undefeated teams by the end of the season, they still didn't believe Ohio State deserved a shot at the national championship. Much of it was attributed to the juggernaut of a football team they would be facing, which were the Miami Hurricanes. They were the defending champs that year and riding an insane 34-game winning streak. Leading up to the championship game, everyone in the media wrote off Ohio State and gave them zero chance of even coming close to winning the game. But those that have seen the game know what actually happened. The Ohio State defense absolutely dominated Miami in this game from start to finish, sacking the quarterback Ken Dorsey 4 times, intercepting him twice, and holding their star running back Willis McGahee, who finished the season with 1,750 yards rushing and 28 touchdowns, to a measly 67 yards on 20 carries. There were so many memorable moments during this game that are still discussed 20 years later today. You had Clarett stripping the ball from Miami safety Sean Taylor in the 3rd quarter after intercepting a pass. You had the controversial pass interference call against Miami in overtime, and you had the rebuttal no-holding/catch call against Ohio State receiver Chris Gamble at the end of the 4th quarter, which, if called correctly, there wouldn't have even been an overtime and Ohio State would have won the game in regulation. This game was the prime definition of a classic, and despite all odds against them, Ohio State came out victorious and won the game 31-24 in a double overtime thriller. So what message did God provide me through this experience? Well, as you recall, similar to the Ohio State football team, I had my own share of doubters leading up to college. Many still thought I was a drug addict and that I wouldn't last a year at Ohio State. But through this championship Ohio State football season, God vicariously provided me the motivation needed to get through those first set of classes and the confidence to ultimately obtain my engineering degree at Ohio State. He was showing me that if you have faith, persevere, work hard, and stay focused, you can accomplish anything you set your eyes on, despite all odds against you. I finished my first quarter of classes at Ohio State with straight A's and ended up graduating in 2006 cum laude with a bachelor's degree in engineering, and then went on to get my master's degree in engineering in 2008. I myself had also defied all odds, and obtaining those degrees was the greatest feeling of redemption I ever had in my life. Now you might have thought this was where the story was going to end, but there's more. Are any of you wondering where those verses I've been sharing in the background came from? Well, it just so happens that a few months after Ohio State won the championship that year, God had something else in mind for me to listen to. Not only did I get another Linkin Park album in 2003, but this other band I found at the exact same time is what I would refer to as Linkin Park on steroids. I found that this band's first album not only contained references that mirrored my personal experiences, but also references on how my relationship with God had been established. Oh, and guess what the name of this band just so happened to be? The name of the band was Shinedown. Now remind me again, whose light shines down upon us in the Bible? Shinedown was a new band at the time from Jacksonville, Florida. Their very first album, fittingly entitled Leave a Whisper, was released in May of 2003. It was such an intense and emotional album, but at the same time you could hear soul seeping out of the songs through lead singer Brent Smith's voice, who, in my opinion, has one of the greatest singing voices I have ever heard. And my goodness, did him and the band do an incredible job putting the emotions of this album on full display during their live performances at the time. The chorus of their first single, Fly From the Inside, contained one of the most powerful verses I've ever heard that still gets to me to this date. And Brent Smith was asked about this song during a 2004 interview, and here was his response. It's about having an unattainable dream that maybe the people around you are telling you you can't accomplish and you're never going to succeed at it. And maybe they're being that way towards you because they didn't go after their dreams. And Fly From the Inside is just a metaphor about believing in yourself and going after anything that seems unattainable. Pretty crazy how much that related to me at the time, right? Hearing the lyrics of this album even today is surreal, because not only can I still hear myself talking to God through them, but I can also hear God talking to me. As displayed throughout this video, there were so many verses from this album that resembled many key parts of my life. Oh, and there's one more quick thing I wanted to mention about both this Shinedown and Linkin Park's albums released in 2003. Guess the number of tracks each of these albums just so happened to have. That's right, 13. Now, I did cheat a little with Shinedown's album because the initial album release only contained 12 tracks. However, I'm attributing this to an intentional delayed addition by God, since Shinedown would eventually re-release the album to contain a 13th track that ended up being one of the best cover songs ever made, Simple Man. And wouldn't you know it, this 13th track just so happens to mention God himself in it. Now, Shinedown's commercial success during their early years didn't come nearly as close to reaching Linkin Park's, but their fan base grew significantly over time, and they would eventually break through to the mainstream with the hit single on their third album, Second Chance. However, by the time this third album was released, they began replacing members of their band and changing their image. The songs and live performances became more and more of a production, which was never really my cup of tea. I'm not knocking the band or anything. I've learned over the years that bands need to evolve over time to remain relevant. But unfortunately, that means generating lyrics that are more abstract and cliché to appeal to a broader audience. Linkin Park went down the same path after their second album. And this reflects the signs from God becoming absent from my life after completing my first year of college, which I'll briefly explain why I think this happened to me in a minute. Now, after hearing all of this, if you still believe these signs were mere coincidences and had nothing to do with God, then I don't think anything will ever convince you. But regardless of what you think, I am 100% certain that God was speaking to me and showing me the path to take during this time in my life, and the results speak for themselves. I ended up remaining dedicated and faithful to my long-distance relationship with Ashley throughout all 6 of my college years, and our relationship remains strong even today since we got married in 2009. And speaking of which, I honestly didn't recognize this until I started making this video. But do you happen to recall how many years I told you we had been married at the beginning of this video? Yep, our 13th anniversary was June 20th, 2022. I mean, do I really have to ask you again if you think it was a coincidence that God just so happened to reach out to me on the eve of my 13th anniversary to make this video? And the craziest thing of all this is I actually finished this video on the day of our 13th anniversary. So that's my story, and it's time to wrap up and reflect on where my relationship with God is today. First, there are some confessions I need to make. After this first year of college, I started mildly reverting to some of my old habits, but not nearly to the extent of where I was in high school. I would often drink on the weekends with friends in college and would even slip up and do drugs here and there. I also expanded my horizons on rock music and started listening to bands that, let's just say, weren't necessarily spreading the message of God. I even bought into the criticism of Linkin Park, and it got to the point where I was ashamed to admit that I liked their early music. Finally, just prior to getting married, I prayed to God and made a promise that Ashley and I would be active members in the church as we began our married lives together. Well, this obviously never happened, even to this very day. Because of all this, I believe God has felt betrayed by me and is the reason why the signs from Him have become absent ever since this first year of college. God had blessed me with so much in such a short period of time in my life, yet the only thing I did for Him in return was drift away. However, I hope making this video will help spark a revival in my relationship with God. I want that feeling again that I had when I first began college, and I know now that I have work to do for this to happen. As the supervisor from my internship said, it is up to us to share the good news of God. And who knows, maybe sharing this story with others will ultimately provide the necessary means for my wife and I to get involved in the church. You know, we often hear people of great faith in the Lord tell us that we all have a purpose in life and that we need to seek and pursue this purpose, but I have yet to find mine. Could sharing this story be my purpose? I guess time will tell. But given the fact that I have no established brand or audience, and that this is my very first video that I've ever published, it is doubtful that sharing this video on YouTube alone will answer this question. I am by no means a professional video maker, so I have no clue if this story will come off as compelling enough to entice a large number of viewers. But I honestly don't care whether this video gets 100 views or 1,000,000 views. As long as it is compelling enough to inspire at least one of you to grow closer in your relationship with God, then that alone is all it will take to convince me that making this video was worth my time. And if you are one of those people struggling with depression or addiction like I was, please reach out to God for help like I did. He is real and will help you. You just have to be prepared to make the commitment to change. At the time of my struggle, I was always so focused on trying to do everything I could to get what I thought I wanted, and that by doing so it would make me happy. But I recall seeing a well-known quote during my experience with God that has stuck with me to this very day, and the saying is, you find happiness in life not through having what you want, but by wanting what you have. Fortunate for us, we all have God, which is all we need to be happy in our lives. We just need to be more willing to reach out to Him when we need help. I sincerely believe that the increase in mental illness in the United States is a direct result of people turning away from Christianity. All the hate, finger-pointing, judging, and divisiveness going on in the world, even by some prominent Christians, is not what Jesus or God had in mind. Instead, we need more stories like this one to be shared and heard, because spreading the Word of God is what Christianity is all about, and not about constantly judging people for their sins. We need a common purpose and something to turn to that unites us and brings us all together again. And it's important to realize that, no matter what we do, evil will always exist in the world from all sides of the political spectrum. All I wish is for us to do better by spreading hope instead of continuing down the path of spreading fear and hatred. Well, this brings us to the end of the video, and if you made it all the way to this point, then I want to thank you sincerely for sticking around and listening to my story. I hope you found it compelling and eye-opening, and I hope it inspires you to grow your relationship with God. If it did, please help spread the word by liking this video and sharing it with others. So long, and may God bless you all.